It's great to welcome back to the program today Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Massachusetts and current professor at the New School University in New York City, Richard Wolff. Professor Wolff, we've been talking for a while now about how there is going to have to be at some point a sort of re-examination of the relationship of humans on this planet to labor and working 40 hours a week or however many hours people work sometimes in the context of increased automation, technological unemployment, etc. I'd love to hear sort of your general thoughts about this first. I mean, are we coming up against a fundamental change in the relationship of humans to work?
Well, I think in some ways we are, and in some ways that's a bit of an escape from what I believe are some of the more urgent problems that we face. We've been in basically a depressed economic situation globally now since at least 2007. That's coming on to almost a decade. And there's considerable evidence that next year, 2016 and 17, will be bad years, economically speaking, at least for most of the world, if not all of it. And I think that we're beginning to come to terms with much hesitation and a good bit of fear, both of which are understandable, with the fact that our economic system, the one we inherited from the generations before us, really is not up to the task. We are not solving the basic economic problems of the majority of the people in the world, not even close. And the gap between the few who are doing very well and everybody else is getting worse, which is another sign of dysfunction. So I think as people try to come to terms with this, they are grasping around for all kinds of theories, such as, do we reorganize work? Such as, is capitalism coming to the end of its historical time, like every other economic system the world has seen? Or, and if that is the case, where do we go next? Or finally, much of the intensity about climate change, the conference going on in Paris right now, these are also signs of a feeling that there's something fundamentally wrong and a beginning of a major search, which I think will define the years ahead to figure out what it is and what we do about it.
Well, I've been looking at a number of different reports, one of which uses the number 40% and another 47%, that 47% of current jobs are at risk of being eliminated essentially by some combination of automation and or artificial intelligence. And when that happens, I imagine sort of two scenarios, neither of which will likely be the ultimate scenario. One is a totally dystopian scenario where we sink into even a greater economic depression. The wage and income and wealth gap becomes even bigger than it is now. And it's a very bad, ugly scenario. The other side would be if we had some sort of awakening of sorts and realized that there's no reason that working 40 hours a week is a prerequisite to sort of being able to have a reasonable, enjoyable life where all of your basic needs are met. As a society, if we had that realization, maybe we really could take this as an opportunity to question what has been the status quo for so long in industrialized society. Is it likely that we will be closer to one or the other side of the broad spectrum I presented there?
No, it's a good spectrum you present, but I think it is fundamentally not yet clear which way the world is going to go, and even, not to depress anyone, but even whether that set of alternatives or something equivalent will be the way this is understood and debated, excuse me, and worked out. Let me mention a couple of things that are markers. Over the last 24 months, two European countries have seriously engaged the proposition that they ought to disconnect work on the one hand from income on the other. That's another way of getting at what you're talking about.
Right.
We have the capacity to produce quite an array of goods and services. And the two countries in question, Switzerland and now Finland, have basically put before their people the proposition that they will use their capacity to produce, deliver an equal income from that to every citizen, and make the whole question of work really much more voluntary, much less central to society, more increasingly tangential or marginal or auxiliary. That's one way to go. Another one would be to say that the human race, because of climate, because of finite resources, and because of technological advance, really could have everybody, and I mean everybody, getting a decent job for maybe 15 to 20 to 25 hours a week. That would be more than we need to sustain the lifestyles that we now take to be, in general, a basic, adequate lifestyle, and that the rest of our time, the other hours of our lives, would be spent in artistic, leisure, relational activities where we do things together that are recreational or collectively edifying. That would require, that direction would require suspending the profit drive. It means that we don't organize work in order that an individual or a group can make a profit from the activity. That's the way we've done it for 300 years. We stop that because that's not compatible with the rearrangement we're talking about, which disconnects work and therefore the profit from work on the one hand to income on the other.
And could such a reorganization happen merely by the actions of individuals and companies, for example, or for such a drastic reorganization to happen, do we need to have the action start from the government level?
Actually, I don't think it's either of those. What we're talking about, no matter which of the various scenarios ends up closest to what eventually happens, all of these things are social movements. That is, we're talking about things that can only be done if and to the extent that there's a massive social movement that wants and pursues that outcome. I don't think individual decisions are adequate. It's a misconnection. You don't solve the kinds of social problems this way with individual action. I know that's been the ideology, particularly of the United States, for a long time, but it was never true. You can't do that. It's a kind of recipe for unbelievable psychic pain, if nothing else, to try to solve social problems with individual decisions. I think it has to be a social movement. Doesn't at all have to be a social movement originating in the government. Indeed, the governments that we now have are so deeply rooted in the status quo, which they express, which they perpetuate, which they enforce, that I would find it highly unlikely that the government would play any kind of leading role. My guess is you're going to have some kind of social movement. It may or may not look like social movements in the past, that is busily pushing forward and saying, we represent a notion that this social change is what will best solve our problems. And that's what I expect will emerge in the years ahead, one or more of them contesting to determine how we deal with the very issues with which you began.
Well, no question that we will continue following this issue, as you will. How could we not, as observers of society and culture and economics? No question about it. And with great interest, we'll be following what's going on in Switzerland and Finland, of course. I'll remind the audience we've been speaking with Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Massachusetts and a professor at the New School University in New York City, economist Richard Wolff. Pleasure as always having you on.
Thank you, David, and I look forward to our next conversation.